So first of all, just a little bit about me. There we go. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I graduated in 1999 from the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine. And I do always like to talk a little bit about what it is to be a naturopathic doctor, because it's not always well known. It is a 4-year full-time program that starts after you've done an undergraduate degree. Our studies as MDs include things like anatomy, physiology, microbiology, biochemistry, and then the therapies that we study are where our studies are different from other medical studies because they focus on nutrition, botanical medicine, acupuncture, homeopathy, hydrotherapy, and also counseling related to making lifestyle changes. Dr. Seeley made reference to the fact that after graduating, I returned to my hometown of Ottawa, and I found myself working for the government, much to my surprise. I started off with a 3-month term contract, and I finally decided it was time to get out of there 12 years later if I was ever going to get around to doing what I had actually trained to do. I was involved with developing and implementing the regulations for natural health products in Canada while I was working with the government. And since 2013, I have been working as a naturopathic doctor in private practice. A couple of other things. One of them is that probably, like many people who develop an interest in MECFS, my interest came from a personal point of view because it's something that's affected my family and my own life, and my practice focuses more and more on these chronic complex illnesses, which includes chronic fatigue, but also fibromyalgia, Lyme disease, things like that. And the other part of my practice is really focused around what I sometimes call aging with grace. And it's about kind of prevention for people who are middle-aged and beyond, and starting to see things like high blood sugars, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, maybe concerns about osteoporosis, and they want to prevent rather than waiting until they have a full-on disease condition. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, first of all, I'd like to talk about exactly what is MECFS. It's quite a handle. And I'm going to break down what does the ME stand for, what does the CFS stand for, why do we call it that. I am going to introduce the diagnostic criteria that are widely used. The most up-to-date ones come from 2020. I'm going to talk about some of the risk factors around who may be diagnosed with MECFS, its relationship or not to long COVID. And then I'm going to put it right up front. The bad news is that there is no cure for MECFS. The good news is that recovery is possible. And I'm going to talk about what that recovery might look like and what kinds of things you might need to consider in order to recover, and why I see it that way. So first of all, what's in a name? It's quite a handle. Typically when I say MECFS, people say, what? What did you just say? It's not a term that's widely recognized. So it stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome. And there's a reason for the handle. First of all, I'm going to break it down. The myalgic encephalomyelitis part is used more commonly in the UK. It was put forward in about in the 1960s after an outbreak, 1955, an outbreak at the Royal Free Hospital in London. And if you break it down, the myalgic is talking about muscle pain and tenderness. Encephalo refers to something relating to the brain. The myel in the myelitis part refers to the spinal cord. And itis, anytime you see itis anywhere, that always means inflammation. So we have inflammation in the brain and spinal cord leading to muscle pain and tenderness. Now, that definition has been criticized. We actually don't have good evidence that shows that there's inflammation going on in the brain, although there has been inflammation identified in the spinal cord. The muscle pain and tenderness isn't a hallmark feature, although it certainly is common. And then we add on the / chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue syndrome was a handle that it was given in the 1980s in the United States. It's been more commonly used across North America than the myalgic encephalomyelitis handle. And patients have quite rightly denounced it for being essentially belittling. First of all, anytime you see a syndrome, you kind of say, oh, that means we don't fully understand it, don't really know what it is that we're dealing with. We've got a constellation of symptoms that we're seeing together in a number of people, but we don't really have a handle on what it is. And then chronic fatigue, first of all, fatigue, well, it's certainly a symptom that is part of the symptom picture. It's a symptom that goes along with a lot of other conditions as well. And it's also very easy to say, well, I'm tired too. You know, I have fatigue. And it's belittling. And so patients rose up and said, we don't like the chronic fatigue syndrome handle. We want to rename it. There were a couple of other names put forward. None of them, for whatever reason, seem to have stuck. And so what has happened is this hybrid where CFS is more widely recognized, but less descriptive. Myalgic encephalomyelitis certainly sounds more serious, but it's not as well understood. And we put them together and we say MECFS, and then we have to explain it every single time. It's less than an ideal scenario, but that's the state of things right now. The diagnostic criteria that I've put on this slide come from a clinician coalition. And I should mention that anybody who wants my references, I'd be more than happy to share them. I did not include them on the slides just in order to save space, but I do have references for anything that I've quoted in these slides. And you just have to ask and I'd be happy to send them to you. So this is a clinician coalition of clinicians who have worked fairly extensively with people who have MECFS. So they're really coming from a place of knowing what they're talking about. There are other definitions. I've looked at many of them, and because this one is newer, it dates to 2020, and also because it was developed by people who've really worked with the syndrome, the condition. I kind of like this definition. So first of all, we have a reduction or an impairment in the ability to do what you used to do. So whether that is running marathons, going to work, chasing after a toddler, you don't get through the days the way that you used to. It's accompanied by a fatigue, which is profound, profound to the point of debilitating, which didn't used to be there, and it's not the result of some ongoing exertion, and it's not relieved by rest. So you can't just sleep it off and feel better the next day. It persists for 6 months or more. In the case of children, they'll diagnose it after 3 months or more of this kind of fatigue. And here's a real, excuse me, a hallmark symptom of MECFS is post-exertional malaise, or PEM. It's sometimes used as a verb. I'm PEMing. And basically, that's where physical or physical or mental exertions can lead to, excuse me, Physical or mental exertions can lead to an exacerbation of your symptoms and a reduction in functioning. One of the interesting things about PEM, and one of the reasons that it's been kind of dismissed and gone unrecognized, is that it typically happens in a delayed fashion. So you can't tell when you are in the middle of your exertion that you're overdoing it. You may not feel worse until the next day or 2 or 3 days later. And then you may find that you get worse, your symptoms get worse, and you feel worse for a number of days, sometimes even a number of weeks if you really overdid it. And the definition that came from the Clinician Coalition says physical or mental exertions. I added the social and emotional part because I think that it's important to recognize that those also are exertions that take energy and can result in a PEM. Next thing is unrefreshing sleep. You don't sleep very well. You don't wake up feeling good. Cognitive impairment, which can be trouble focusing or concentrating, difficulty finding words, an inability to sit down and read a book or an article. That, of course, can lead to real difficulty doing your work if you have any kind of a office type job. And the other thing is or orthostatic intolerance. Orthostatic intolerance means that when you go from a sitting or a lying down position to standing, your blood pressure can drop and you feel dizzy or lightheaded, sometimes to the point that you might faint. There are various versions of orthostatic intolerance. That's a bit of an umbrella or a catch-all phrase. The symptoms have to be moderate to severe, and they have to be present at least 50% of the time for a diagnosis of MECFS to be made. And the other thing is that, again, because we're dealing with a syndrome that's not well understood, there is no definitive test that can be done that says you have MECFS. It's a bit of a diagnosis of exclusion. And there are other things that can resemble the symptoms of MECFS. So it's important to not diagnose yourself, but to actually have a workup with somebody who has the experience and the ability to order tests and be able to rule out some of the other common things. It's also very common to have other conditions in addition to MECFS. Many people with MECFS also meet the criteria for a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. Multiple chemical sensitivities are another common coexisting condition. Thyroid disease, gastrointestinal diseases, IBS is a common co-diagnosis. And so lots of other things that can be going on at the same time. Other possible symptoms that can go along with a diagnosis of MECFS, but aren't necessary in order to have that diagnosis. One of them is ataxia, which is a difficulty in coordination. The World Health Organization actually classifies MECFS as a neurological condition. So, you know, the idea that the nervous system is affected and therefore there are difficulties in coordination makes sense from that point of view. I don't think it's on this list, but I've seen muscle twitching is another one that that can happen. There can be widespread pain. It can be a nerve pain. It can also be muscle aches and pains, and it can be joint pains as well. Headaches are common. Various kinds of sleep disturbances that undoubtedly contribute to the unrefreshing sleep that people have. Visual disturbances like an inability to focus, blurred vision, occasionally double vision, which also speaks to it being a neurological condition. Sensitivities to light, to noise, to touch, to chemicals, the multiple chemical sensitivity angle, sudden intolerances to foods that you used to tolerate, having to reduce the dosages of drugs or supplements that you take because you're just so oversensitive, very typical features of MECFS. Some people experience flu-like symptoms, which can include a sore throat or tender lymph nodes, low-grade fevers. Especially those symptoms can come back to haunt them if they have overexerted and they're experiencing post-exertional malaise. An increased susceptibility to other infections, so whatever's going around, you're likely to catch it. Gastrointestinal problems, including, IBS, diarrhea, heartburn, all kinds of things can show up. It's not uncommon to see genitourinary symptoms, pelvic pain, interstitial cystitis. Respiratory issues can include air hunger, that feeling that you're just trying to take a breath in and you can't quite get a full breath. Difficulty regulating body temperature. So you can feel chilled, you can feel over warm, you can alternate between them. Muscle weakness or loss of strength, and stiffness and pain in the neck or the back. Very common. So who gets MECFS? Well, around 80% of people report an infectious onset. That's really interesting because there's been a great deal of effort and research to try and identify what might be the triggering infection. And this, I think, is where, from a conventional point of view, researchers have really had a hard time because the common wisdom is that if you have this particular microbe, it leads to this particular disease. So, you get measles virus, then you're going to catch measles. In the case of MECFS, there isn't a single virus or bacterium that's been isolated. There are many. So candidates include Epstein-Barr virus, human herpes virus or HHV6, an enterovirus, an unnamed enterovirus, which would be related to the polio virus. Also bacterial infections like Lyme or Mycoplasma. And potentially, you notice I put question marks there, SARS-CoV-2, which is COVID-19. MECFS is more often diagnosed in Caucasian women, so women and Caucasian, both. It's not clear whether they're in fact more susceptible or they're just more likely to be diagnosed. It is most commonly diagnosed in middle age, but that doesn't mean that other age groups are spared. It absolutely has appeared in children, in adolescents, and in older people as well. There is potentially a genetic link. The risk does seem to be higher if you have a close family member with MECFS, but it's not really clear what that genetic link is, or if that's association that may be related to the infectious factor. So you can tell as I speak that there are a lot of unanswered questions. For quite a long time, and still today, there was a tendency to look at MECFS as potentially a psychological condition, something that you just needed to get over. One of the lines that I saw that I, liked, that I thought was very telling, was the reference to MECFS as a fashionable form of hypochondria. In the 1980s, there was an outbreak in the US and it became known for a while as the yuppie flu. In more recent years, thank heavens, there are some researchers that have done a deeper dive. And what they've found is that even though nothing tends to show up on standard testing. So you go see your doctor, you say you're not feeling well, they send you for some blood work, maybe a couple of imaging studies, and everything looks just fine and normal, and they tell you that there's not a problem, even though you know that you don't feel good and that you're sick. The deeper dive has started to surface irregularities in immune function, irregularities in the nervous system, imbalances in the endocrine system, which is, your hormones. And I mean, you can see that from 2 points of view. That's not good news, but on the other hand, it really is affirming and validating to say, yes, these things are going on, and it helps us to have some idea of how to address them. But then the other thing that definitely increases risk is stress. Many people do report an onset shortly after a stressful event of some kind. That can be an emotional stress, it can be a physical stress like a car accident, but something that seems to trigger the house of cards to come tumbling down. So, big question, is long COVID the same thing as MECFS? There was a systematic review published in April this year. It found that 25 out of 29 known MECFS symptoms were listed among the symptoms that were being reported in those who were suffering from long COVID. So there's definitely an overlap of symptoms. A study in August this year reported that people with acute COVID-19 and with MECFS have certain biological changes that they can measure, including redox imbalance, systemic inflammation, neuroinflammation, which is inflammation of the nervous system, and an impaired ability to generate ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy molecule produced by your mitochondria. And that's one area of current research because it does seem to be that that's malfunctioning in people who have MECFS, and that the mitochondrial malfunction leads to the lack of energy, literally. Interesting, a study from September 2006 found that previous coronaviruses, the original SARS in 2003 and MERS, which was Middle East, I forget what the R stands for, but related, it was a coronavirus. They reported that about 11% of people who had had those infections later were diagnosed with MECFS. So there's a relationship. We don't know yet if they're the same thing, but the similarities are sufficient to take a guess that a treatment approach might be similar. I should also add, though, that in terms of long COVID, when I'm talking about the relationship between long COVID and MECFS, it's not I'm not necessarily talking about the people who had a really severe case of COVID and were hospitalized and are suffering from the after effects of having been in the ICU and on a ventilator. That's a whole different type of rehab that may or may not carry the same symptoms as MECFS. And right now, of course, COVID is something that's still actively being researched and we're still learning about it. But the reports coming in these days are estimating that anywhere from 30 to 50% of people who have had a COVID infection of any type, mild to moderate to severe, are reporting some type of some level of symptoms up to 6 months later. Now that may be just an alteration in the sense of taste and smell and nothing else. It could be debilitating symptoms similar to MECFS, or it could be the consequences of having had to stay in ICU. So all of that leads to the question, well, how do I get better? You know, going back to the whole, you know, if we can take the same therapeutic approach to long COVID or similar therapeutic approach, well, what do you do? These quotes that I've included came from a government website. This one happened to be from BC. But honestly, it's kind of bleak. There is no treatment for MECFS. You can manage the symptoms. It went on to outline that, your doctor might suggest sleeping pills, pain medications, stimulants to help to increase your energy, blood pressure medications if you have orthostatic intolerance, antidepressants. And then they go on to say, well, learning to cope with your symptoms and talking to others may be helpful. To me, that was kind of a bleak prognosis. And yet there's not much else being offered from a conventional point of view. They really just are saying manage the symptoms. And so that's where, as a naturopathic doctor, I'm going to put on a different hat. And I'm going to invite you to consider with me the idea that what we're looking for isn't just the gene that leads to MECFS, or the medication that's going to make everything all better, or even the ideal diet that's going to help things, but that what actually is necessary is considering what I believe to be the root causes of all illness, most illness. So there are 5 of them, and I talk about them frequently with my patients. First of all, I talk about lifestyle factors, the obvious: diet, sleep, exercise, stress. Those are things I've started saying, I think I need to find a new word as opposed to lifestyle, because the implication of lifestyle is that these are factors that are under your control. And to a degree, that's true. And to a degree, it's also problematic, because we know, for example, that sleep disturbances are part of the symptomatology of MECFS. You might lie down to go to sleep exhausted and not be able to fall asleep, or more commonly, not be able to stay asleep all night, or have interrupted sleep and wake up in the morning still feeling terrible. In my household, we use a highly technical term, FLC. It stands for feeling like crap. So the lifestyle factors absolutely can contribute to disease and to disease processes, and they're probably the area where you have the most control, but I recognize that they're not completely under your control either. Next, we have environmental factors, things like heavy metals, pesticides, antibiotic residues, hormone disrupting chemicals, and other environmental toxins. We have your genetic inheritance. You don't get to change that, and you don't get to choose it, but it might speak to where your weaknesses are. And if you can identify some of your genetic weaknesses or trends, sometimes it's a question of supporting those areas. If you detoxify more slowly than some people, for example, well, maybe that's something that can be supported nutritionally. Very often that's the case. Are you more susceptible to certain infections? Can we support the immune system? Which leads me to the next factor, infection. Infection can be obvious where you feel sick, and it can also be hidden. Sometimes you might have a parasite hiding in your gut. You might have dental infections. You might have mold exposure, and the molds can be colonizing your sinuses. And that's a draw on the immune system that can keep you sick. And finally, the factor that I think has been the least well acknowledged among what I consider the root causes, and definitely the least well addressed, is trauma. Trauma can be physical. It can be the car accident or the injury, and it can also be emotional. It doesn't have to be major trauma. Sometimes the word trauma is off-putting because people think of that in terms of, having experienced war zone or abuse or things like that. Of course, that is some people's experience, but on the other hand, we all carry wounds of some type, and sometimes if they haven't been addressed, the fact that we're carrying them can in fact contribute to keeping us sick. So next I'd like to introduce you, this is all part of my philosophical underpinnings of illness, to the barrel theory of illness. This was introduced by a pediatric allergist named Dr. Doris Rapp. She worked in New England in the 1970s. And basically what it's an analogy. The barrel is your body, and when you're born, the barrel is mostly empty. Maybe you've got some sludge sloshing around at the bottom. We know from testing that newborns, the cord blood can contain over 200 chemicals from the environment that are non-natural and didn't exist if we went back, say, 200 years. So, you know, sludge that's sloshing around down there at the bottom when you're born could include things like that. It could also include things like emotional trauma that your mom suffered during the pregnancy, which we know can be a factor in children developing asthma and things like that. But basically, your barrel's empty. And then you start to go through life. And what happens? Your barrel starts to fill up. And so maybe you have, your parents have a messy divorce, and there was some feelings of loss and grief that weren't addressed. Maybe there were some feelings of abandonment. Maybe there was fear about what was going to happen to you, and none of those were acknowledged or addressed. You carry them around with you. Maybe you drink lots of water from those soft plastic bottles that leach BPA into your water, and you start to sequester that in your body. You had a project where you wanted to scrape the old paint off a windowsill, and it contained lead, and you inhale that, and that also is sequestered in the body, typically in the bones. You have a bunch of mercury fillings, you have chronic infections in the sinuses. You can see how your barrel is starting to fill up. By this point, you might be starting to spring leaks, and those leaks are what we call symptoms. So, you know, maybe you have some skin rashes, maybe you have chronic sinusitis and you've got some treatment going on. Maybe you're prone to infections because the barrel's filling up until you reach the top of the barrel and it overflows. And that's the last straw. That's the infection or whatever it is, stressful factor that triggers the full-blown overflow where suddenly your body just can't take it anymore and your system falls apart and you have MECFS. So for many people, the onset is sudden. You know, they might have been building up all these risk factors through their whole life, but it's a last straw, that stressful event, that infection. For some people, the symptoms of MECFS actually creep up slowly, and they look back over the course of a year or 18 months and they say, oh yeah, you know, it was happening gradually. I can start to see where my energy was going down. And then again, they hit a point where they just can't carry on anymore with the activities that they've been used to doing. And what do you do about it? Well, you've got two choices, and they're both necessary. You can make your barrel bigger, or you can empty your barrel. Making your barrel bigger is what I call building your foundation. You know, if you're building a house and you've got a weak foundation, doesn't matter how well you build the rest of the house, that house is always going to be on a weak foundation and at risk of collapsing. So what do you do to build a bigger barrel? Well, some of the things that are important are restorative sleep, an anti-inflammatory and nutritionally dense diet. And I've given you the name of a book that I sometimes refer people to for a diet that is just kind of a generally whole foods, wholesome diet. For some people, especially people who are experiencing digestive symptoms, it may not be sufficient. There can be other things going on that need to be identified and addressed, but it's a good base. Healing the gut. Most, if not all, people who have MECFS have some degree of compromise in their gut, whether they know it or not, whether their symptoms are happening in the digestive tract or not. Regular moderate exercise is something that's part of building a strong foundation, and you will notice that wherever I put exercise, the word exercise in my slides, I also put a little asterisk because I am very aware that post-exertional malaise is triggered by exercise, and I'm going to come to that and speak to it again in a little bit. The types of exercise that I do tend to recommend are things like yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, which are, or at least they can be, gentle forms of exercise that can be done at your pace and to the degree that you are able to at any given time for many people. And I also recognize that there are some people with severe MECFS who are not in a position to be doing any kind of exercise. There are people who are completely bedbound and for whom, you know, getting out of bed and making their way to the bathroom is the exercise that they're going to get. And that's enough to create a PEM reaction for them. And then moderating your stress response is just increasing your resilience. It can be things like a mindfulness or daily meditation practice. It can be nature walks. It can be finding something to laugh about. It can be maintaining social connections, those kinds of things. So those are something that you can work on your own. These are areas that are ripe for self-management. And they're also areas that sometimes can be fine-tuned with a little bit of guidance. And then the other side of it, emptying your barrel, are things like eliminating the toxic chemicals that you bring into your day-to-day world, personal care products, being careful what's in them, what are you putting on your skin and absorbing into your body. Are you drinking from those plastic water bottles that can leach BPA? Or do you get the plastic bottles that say BPA free, only now we're finding out that whatever they use to substitute for BPA may be just as bad as the BPA or potentially even worse. Sadly, that's a recent study that I saw. It may also be necessary to supplement your diet with nutrients to support healthy detoxification, to identify and eradicate hidden infections, which can linger in your sinuses, in your digestive tract. There are lots of options. Dental infections are another hidden area that can, again, just draw down at your ability to heal. Addressing musculoskeletal imbalances and old injuries, dealing with emotional trauma, and there are many other options in terms of emptying your barrel. So coming back to the question that I posed earlier, well, what can you do to get better? First of all, I think there's an element of acceptance that's necessary. You can't just go straight back to your old normal. And this is such a tough one because many people who develop MECFS are high achieving, high energy people that are used to running marathons, chasing after kids, working, going to school at the same time. You know, they're really high energy people who expect a lot of themselves and want to go straight back in. And there was a poll done of people who had lived with MECFS for a number of years. And the question that they were asked was, what do you wish you had known when you first got sick, or what do you wish you had done differently? And the most common answer was, I wish I had realized that it could get worse. I wish I had understood that I needed to back off and not push myself and give myself time to recover before I went back to my normal or old activities. And that is something that I consider a real cautionary tale. So recognizing that rushing back to your old normal is probably not doing you any favors. It's also important to recruit support. This is a condition that you're in for the long haul. You don't tend to heal instantly. There's no magic wand to be waved. And so it's really important to educate your family and your friends about what it is you're dealing with and what you need from them. You may need to educate your practitioners as well. And I advocate for assembling a team of practitioners with various points of view. I think it's important, if you're in Ontario and in a lot of other jurisdictions, to have a medical doctor, because that's an access route to a variety of testing that as a naturopathic doctor I can't offer. There are specialists who can bring a perspective that can be really important. As a naturopathic doctor, I've been giving you my perspective on why I think naturopathic medicine has something to offer, because we're really trying to dig at the root causes. And although it's a long game, people do recover when you take a holistic approach, as opposed to just trying to find the gene, the right medication, the right diet that you can apply. Because emotional wounding can be a part of it, I also advocate for including a counselor or a psychotherapist on your team, and body workers, osteopaths, physiotherapists, massage therapists. In many ways, I think our body workers are really the healers of our time. And I really think that they should be included as an adjunct to any and all treatments that you might be undertaking. Addressing the lifestyle factors that are within your control. So the diet, the sleep, the stress response, the exercise, with the asterisk, I'm still getting there. I will talk in a moment about it. It's also important to manage the symptoms that are really debilitating. So reducing pain and inflammation that is causing the pain. Improving your sleep. To some degree, that might be on you. That might be about sleep hygiene, making sure that you're getting to bed at regular times, aiming to get up at regular times, not spending your evenings looking at screens and things like that. But there may also be a place for supplements that can help you to maintain your sleep so that you sleep all night, for example. There are herbs that can be very helpful in that regard. Regulating blood sugars, which, because that's something that's regulated by your hormones and your hormones are likely to be imbalanced, is a common thing that is identified on blood tests and is causing damage at the cellular level if they're commonly running too high, or if they're running too low, leaving you feeling shaky and weak and lightheaded and just in a really bad state. Healing the gut, supporting mitochondrial function. So that can help to improve energy. So managing symptoms in order to help you to feel better, and sometimes help to give you the energy to do the deeper work that needs to be done. And then finally, identifying the root causes that have the most weight in your particular case and working to address them, recognizing that that takes time. Now, I recognize that I haven't been very specific. I'm giving you some really broad treatment strategies. I said I was also going to talk about exercise, and I do want to emphasize something that I say over and over again to people who consult me. Exercise is only good for you when it's good for you. If it takes longer than 24 hours for you to recover from any exertion, which might be physical exercise, or it might be you sat down to do your taxes, which is a mental exertion, or you went out and socialized with friends in the evening, a social exertion, or an emotional exertion. You had a fight with your teenage son or something like that. All of those things can deplete your energy. If you haven't recovered within 24 hours, then you overdid it for you at this time, and it was not good for you. Physical exercise is probably the one that people are most inclined to overdo in my experience. And hence my injunction: exercise is only good for you when it's good for you. And one of the real strategies to managing a life with MECFS is a term we call pacing, which simply means adapting your activities to your energy level. The people who have recovered best in the long term are the people who, rather than pushing themselves through cycles of intense activity that leads to a crash, that they recover from to return to something that pushes them right to their limit until they crash again, the long-term result of that kind of pattern is an overall decline in health. Adapting your activities so that you stay within what we sometimes refer to as an energy envelope. You figure out what your own personal energy envelope is, and you stay within it. The way that you gauge it is that you have returned to your baseline within 24 hours. And the purpose overall is that you avoid the post-exertional malaise. Dr. Eleanor Stein in Alberta is both a psychologist and an MECFS sufferer for many years now. And she developed the term deep pacing, which she defines as adapting your activities. So it's the pacing, adapting your activities to your energy level with mindfulness and an attitude of self-care. And her point being that, and she acknowledges it took her a long time to get there, that it's very typical to resist the idea that there are limits, resist the need to cut back on your activities, resist the call to get things done, the fact that you are needed, and to really put a premium on self-care. It's a tough thing to do, and in the long term, people who take it on tend to find that their energy envelope gradually expands if they keep themselves out of that constant cycle of crash and burn. One of the recommendations that I would make when you are introducing pacing is to keep a journal. Keeping a journal of your symptoms so that you have a written record helps you to see over time whether you're improving. It helps you to remember some of the things that sent you into a crash so that maybe you don't do it a second time or a third time. It can be encouraging. It can help you to say, wow, if I look back 6 months, I was in much worse shape than I am today. And so you can see progress even when the progress is slow. Common ways to make things worse. Well, I've already referred to the crash and burn approach. When you don't accept your limitations and you push yourself right to your limit and maybe beyond the limits that you actually have, and then you push yourself into a real decline, you are unlikely to get better over time. Beating up on yourself because you can't do the things that you want to do, that you used to do, that other people are hoping or expecting you should do, isn't helpful to getting better. And that's where sometimes it can be helpful to work with an advocate, work with a counselor who understands what it's like to have chronic illness, and help you to say no, learn to say no to other people, learn to set your limits and boundaries. Becoming isolated. Chronic illness is isolating. Chronic illness is boring to other people, and you may find that people don't know what to say. They stop inviting you to participate in things. They stop calling. When you have the energy for it, it's really good to keep reaching out to people, and it's really good to communicate that it's not that you want to be isolated, it's that your condition doesn't always allow you to be social, but when you have the energy, you really would appreciate, having some time together, whether that's by Zoom, whether that's a cup of tea with somebody, maybe a walk if you're up for it, those kinds of activities, without pushing yourself. Propping yourself up with coffee and other stimulants that create the illusion of energy. That's one way of pushing yourself in that crash and burn cycle. And in the long term, it is not helpful. And another thing that can happen is numbing yourself with alcohol, with other substances, because chronic illness is also depressing. And it can be a real struggle emotionally to accept it and live with it. And it is not uncommon for people to develop dependence issues that they didn't have. So these next 3 slides, I'm not going to read to you because they're really dense. Basically, this is a way of rating how sick you are, and it's commonly used in conjunction with activity logs. I said keep a journal so that you can take kind of a daily pulse. When you wake up in the morning, think about where are you today on this scale, write it down. And like I say, you can create graphs, you can look back 6 months and see where you were. You can have an idea of whether you're getting better or not, and take that as a sign that what you're doing is helpful or that you need to introduce other things. So I'm not going to read this to you. I'm just going to let you read those on your own. They come from Dr. Alison Bested and Lynn Marshall, who worked for a long time at the Environmental Health Clinic, Women's College Hospital in Toronto. And finally, this is a graph that outlines how everybody hopes and wishes they are going to recover. It's a straight line. You start at the bottom, you're sick, and you're just going to go straight up that graph and back to normal the way you knew it. In actual fact, this tends to be what recovery looks like. It's that terrible squiggly line. You will notice that our little stick figure higher up is higher up as she moves up the graph than she was at the beginning. So in other words, recovery is underway, but look at all the setbacks that she had to live with. That is also a reality of recovery. It doesn't tend to take place in that straight line that we all wish and hope for. It tends to involve setbacks and disappointments. I will make a plug for saying, you know, the setbacks can be mitigated by working with people who have experience so that you don't have to figure it all out for yourself. A support group is a marvelous thing. People who have experience and can say, hey, you know, that just doesn't tend to be helpful. Careful, are you overdoing it? Those kinds of things. And that's where the idea of having a team on your side comes into the whole idea of recovery. So what I'm talking about, I notice I don't use the word cure. Recovery means many different things. It may not mean that you return to the pre-illness normal that you were used to. You may not go back to 100%. But hey, living life at 80% is a whole lot better than living life at 20%. And there is always hope for future recovery. It can be very slow, and gradual and frustrating because of that. But I know many people who over the course of 2 years or 6 years have recovered to the point of saying, you know, this is a good life. I may not be at 100%, but I think I'm at 90, maybe even 95 some days. Some days I have a 70% day, but it's a good life. I've included some resources to things that I think can be helpful. I mentioned Dr. Ellie Stein in Alberta. She offers an online course that I highly recommend. It's paid. There is a cost, in other words, but it's a very useful thing. A blog called Health Rising that's maintained by somebody who has lived with MECFS for many years. A book from Dr. Alison Bested. The document that I quoted for the diagnostic criteria that also includes a discussion of treatment strategies and also testing that can be useful. And then a couple of things. The spoon theory, I encourage you to read it. It's a useful way of helping to explain illness to family and friends who might not really get it. And the Return to Wellness blog is also one that it's actually where I took those little graphs that I showed you. These guys with the stick figures. It's somebody who works as a counselor for people who have various forms of chronic illness, and lots of just nuggets in there. I think it's absolutely worth spending some time reading through.